Mark gets up at 5:40 before the sun, before the world asks anything of him. He doesn't set an alarm anymore. His body just knows. He makes 1 cup of coffee, not 2, and he drinks it standing at the kitchen window watching the porch light of the house across the street blink off. There's a rhythm to his mornings that no one else shapes. No one to negotiate the thermostat with. No one to ask what he's thinking. He likes it that way, or at least that's what he tells the mirror. By 6:15 he's in his truck, radio low, driving roads he's driven for 20 years, and there's a strange, settled comfort in the silence. This is not a man who seems lonely. This is a man who seems, by every visible measure, at peace. But if you sat with Mark long enough, if you watched the way his eyes drift toward his phone on a Friday night and then drift away again, you'd start to wonder whether peace and avoidance sometimes wear the same jacket. Men like Mark are everywhere. They mow their own lawns and fix their own faucets and eat dinner standing over the sink because setting a table for one feels like a small, unnecessary defeat. They've built lives that function beautifully without requiring another person's presence, and there's a quiet dignity in that. They don't cancel plans because they're overwhelmed with obligations. They cancel plans because they never quite made them. The phone rings and something in their chest tightens before they even see the name. Not because they dislike people. Because conversation has a way of asking for things they've stopped offering. They'll tell you they're introverts, that they just need their space, that they've never been the type to sit around talking about feelings. And there's truth in that. But watch closely and you'll notice something else. The long drives that have no destination. The hobbies pursued alone that used to be shared. The way they check the game score instead of calling the friend who used to watch it with them. The unread text that sits there for 4 days, not because he's busy, but because answering it means stepping back into a rhythm of reciprocity he's quietly let go slack. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a man's house after a certain age. It isn't emptiness exactly. It's more like a room that has learned to hold its own shape. Mark could tell you the sound his own footsteps make on the hallway floor at 11 at night, a sound so familiar it barely registers, and yet if you asked him the last time another set of footsteps moved through that same hallway, he'd have to think about it. This is the recognition loop so many men fall into without naming it. Solitude as default, connection as exception, and the exception growing rarer every year without anyone deciding it should. Society didn't build this pattern by accident. Gen X men grew up in a specific cultural moment, sandwiched between the stoic silence of their fathers and a world that hadn't yet given men permission to talk about anything beneath the surface. They were told to be tough, to handle it, to not make a scene. Divorce rates climbed through their childhoods, and many of them learned early that adults leave, that reliance is a liability. Male friendship in that era was built on proximity and activity, not disclosure. You had friends because you worked together, played sports together, drank together. When the job ended or the team disbanded, the friendship often quietly ended too, because it was never built on anything that could survive distance. Research on adult male friendship consistently shows the same pattern. Men accumulate fewer close friends as they age, not because they stop wanting connection, but because the scaffolding that used to create it disappears, and nothing replaces it. No one teaches a 48-year-old man how to make a new friend. It's assumed he already knows, or that he no longer needs to. And so the men of this generation drift into their 50s and 60s carrying an unspoken skill they were never taught, the skill of reaching out first, and without it, they wait. They wait for someone else to call, to organize, to keep the thread alive, And when no one does, they mistake the silence for a verdict rather than a gap that anyone could have filled. The deeper psychology sits further back than any of this, back in the small rooms of childhood. A boy who cried and was told to toughen up learns, cell by cell, that emotional expression carries a cost. A boy who watched his father go silent under stress learns that silence is what strength looks like. These aren't conscious decisions. They're patterns laid down long before language could name them, and by the time that boy is a man, the wiring feels like personality rather than conditioning. Psychology calls this early experience attachment learning, and for a lot of Gen X men, the lesson absorbed wasn't that people are unsafe exactly, but that needing people is unsafe. There's a difference. He can love someone deeply and still recoil from depending on them, because dependence, somewhere in his nervous system, still means risk. Self-reliance becomes a coping mechanism disguised as a personality trait. It solves an old problem so effectively that it starts to look like identity itself. He isn't guarded because he's cold. He's guarded because guardedness once kept him from being hurt, and the body remembers what worked, long after the original threat has vanished. This is the quiet trick of psychological conditioning. It doesn't announce itself as protection. It simply becomes the water a man swims in, invisible precisely because it's everywhere. And this is where the contradiction lives, right at the center of the whole thing. These are men who will drive 4 hours to help a friend move a couch and never once mention that their own marriage is falling apart. Men who remember every birthday, who show up for every emergency, who are fiercely, quietly loyal, and who will not say the words, "I miss you" out loud if their life depended on it. They want connection. They built lives that make it nearly impossible to receive it. They miss the friends they used to have, but they won't be the one to call first, because calling first means admitting the need existed, and admitting the need existed means risking that it won't be returned. So the phone stays in the pocket. The years pass. The men tell themselves and everyone else that this is simply who they are. Independent, low maintenance, fine on their own. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes that's completely true. Sometimes solitude really is the most honest, restorative way a man can live. The tension isn't that solitude is fake. The tension is that no one, including the man himself, can always tell the difference between chosen peace and practiced defense, and most men have never been given a reason to sit still long enough to find out. So which is it? When a man says he prefers being alone, is that a preference or a scar that learned to speak in the language of preference? Is contentment something you can fake convincingly enough that it becomes real, or does the body eventually tell on you, in the racing heart before a returned call, in the extra hour spent doing anything but sitting still with the quiet? Maybe the honest answer is that both things can be true inside the same man, on the same day, in the same hour. He can genuinely treasure his solitude and also feel a small ache when a friend's name flashes on the screen and he lets it go to voicemail out of habit rather than intention. Maybe the real question isn't whether he's lonely or content. Maybe it's whether he's ever slowed down long enough to ask himself the difference. Most men never do, not because they're incapable, but because the entire architecture of their upbringing rewarded not asking. Curiosity about your own inner life wasn't modeled. Survival was. There's something else worth sitting with here. Isolation and solitude look identical from the outside but feel entirely different from the inside, and very few men have been given the tools to tell which one they're living in. Solitude restores. Isolation depletes, quietly, over years. until a man is 70 years old and can't remember the last time someone touched his shoulder or asked how he was really doing and waited for the real answer. The frightening part isn't loneliness itself. It's how comfortable a man can become inside it, how a life built entirely around avoiding disappointment can start to feel like fulfillment simply because the alternative, reaching out and possibly being let down, feels heavier than the quiet ever could. And there's a version of this that hides in plain sight, the man who mistakes being surrounded for being connected, who has coworkers and gym buddies and a full calendar and still goes home to a house where nobody knows what actually keeps him up at night. Busyness can be its own kind of solitude, dressed up so well that even he doesn't recognize it. Maybe the truth is this: freedom and connection were never actually opposites. They only became opponents because somewhere along the way, connection got tangled up with vulnerability, and vulnerability got tangled up with danger. A man doesn't have to choose between being independent and being close to people. He was taught that he did, by circumstance, by generation, by every silent father who never showed him another way. The peace some of these men have found is real. It is not a lie. But real peace doesn't flinch when the phone rings. Real peace doesn't need distance to survive. And that difference, subtle as it is, might be the entire story hiding underneath the coffee cup at 5:40 in the morning, underneath the long drives with no destination, underneath every version of "I'm fine on my own" that a man has ever said, half believing it, half hoping someone would ask him if it was true. Mark still drinks his coffee alone most mornings. He still likes the quiet. Some nights, though, he sits with his phone in his hand a little longer than usual, thumb hovering over a name he hasn't dialed in 3 years, and he doesn't call, not tonight, but he doesn't put the phone down right away either. Maybe that's not indecision. Maybe that's the most honest moment of his entire day.